From London, this is the Orwellians podcast. I'm Roland Elliott Brown. My guest today is Daniela Richterova. Daniela is a senior lecturer in intelligence studies at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. She is the author of Watching the Jackals, Prague's Covert Liaisons with Terrorists and Revolutionaries. Daniela, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Roland.
Glad to have you here. So I'd like to start with the amazing story of the opening of the Security Services Archive in the Czech Republic, which holds the files of the old Czechoslovak State Security Service, STB. You've described the level of access the Czech state has granted as the most liberal in post-communist Europe. How did that come about?
Yeah, I think that's a great place to start because there wouldn't be a book without any of these sources. And I was really lucky to be able to work in the Security Services Archive in Prague, as well as a couple of other archives in the city. I mean, without them, we wouldn't really know anything about the Cold War and especially its security services. And the reason why I say that the Czech Republic has the most liberal access law to these kind of archives is that what you really get when you start working in these archives are various types of files that you wouldn't get anywhere else. So these are personal files of officers. These are files of agents, of various types of agents, but also of the victims. And there's no redactation. So those of listeners and viewers who would have gone to archives in the US or in the UK, they'll know that oftentimes when you sit down and open that file and you're really hopeful about what you'll find, a lot of it will be blacked out or white out. And so you won't really learn much. So there's none of that when it comes to Cold War materials up until 1989, November 1989, when the revolution began. Now, why did the Czech Republic go for this? So there's much more qualified people and fantastic archivists and legal scholars who could talk about that. But basically, the main idea was that a way to come to terms with a totalitarian regime such as the one that ruled over Czechoslovakia between 1948 and 1989, and also during World War II when the Germans occupied. The best way to kind of come to terms with that is to really have insight and provide people, scholars, but also private citizens insight into what the regime did. And this doesn't mean just into high politics, into big decisions, but also into what the security service was doing, because the security service was in many ways implementing the regime's politics abroad, but also domestically, and that meant suppressing a lot of freedoms of Czechoslovaks. So this is kind of the rationale. So it was never just about let's open an archive. This is about dealing with the past and coming to terms with the past by the way of disclosure.
Mm-hmm. And when you get into an archive like that, I mean, it must be quite daunting. I mean, the material is presumably organized, categorized, cataloged. How do you decide where to start?
That's a really good question. And I think for everyone, the start is quite complicated. You typically have to work with archivists and talk to them about what your project is, and they can give you advice on where to start. Like with many archives, it's good to start with names of key actors, names of groups, names of places or countries. But I think if you want to do the project you're working on really thoroughly in every archive, I think you need to have a good conversation with the people who know the archive in and out. So I was quite lucky to be able to have those conversations. But I remember that the first time, and I think I mentioned this in the book, the first time I came into the archive when I was promised that I'll get access to some of the core files, these operational files of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. There was a employee of the archive who basically came in with a trolley with about 15 boxes. And I remember seeing that, and my reaction to that was one of, excitement and dread. And I think a lot of researchers who work in this field and who are lucky enough to have archives which are open and quite liberal, and this is a common and dissonance that they face. Because ultimately, for me, the most difficult bit was that you're reading the files as they were handed over by the totalitarian regime to the democratic regime. So no one did like an executive summary of, hey guys, this is what you'll find here. Let us help you understand what we did during the Cold War. So it's almost like detective work. I think the first file, when I opened it, I think the first report there was a surveillance file of a person who I never heard of. And so you just have to push through, you have to make notes, you have to then draw parallels and, find parallels between people, places, events. So it was a lot of detective work. It was very exciting, though, and very rewarding.
So, although your book is largely concerned with the STB's relationship with Palestinian organizations, non-state actors associated with the Palestinian cause, you begin with the early Cold War, the 1950s, Prague's involvement with African and Latin American armed groups. Tell us about how those relationships set the precedents for the relations with armed Palestinian groups.
Yes, I wanted to put the story of these various Palestinian and Palestinian associated groups into a broader context of Czechoslovak foreign policy. I mean, ultimately, the book is not a history of the PLO or the Palestinian resistance or their use of covert operations. It's a book about how states use their spies to either push terrorists out or to collaborate with them, and about that great space in between those two. So I wanted to put the story of the Palestinians into the context of other historical events and of other liaison with other groups. And for communist Czechoslovakia, the first groups that started ringing their doorbell metaphorically were African groups in the late 50s and in the early 60s. Many of these groups were fighting liberation wars against some of the colonial powers, and they needed support. They needed money, they needed guns, they needed political backing. And so groups from Algeria, from Guinea-Bissau, from Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe, and even from the ANC and its armed wing called Mkonto Wesizwe. They went in the way of countries such as Czechoslovakia. They also talked to the East Germans, the Bulgarians, and others. Basically Czechoslovakia's and the Soviet bloc's goal here, as I think was quite astutely summarized by Markus Wolf, who was the head of the East German Foreign Intelligence Service, was to use these relations to paint the world in their shade of red, in the shade of red of the Soviet bloc. So basically in the late 50s and in the 60s, Czechoslovakia, as well as some other countries, provided this support to these groups. Sometimes this was in theater, so you would have Czechoslovak, say, trainers or people who could operate some of the weapons that they were given, go to places in West Africa or in Southern Africa, or you'd have some of these members of these groups come over to Czechoslovakia, which was quite precarious because getting there in the 60s without being seen on fake documents and you're traveling internationally for the first time could be quite complicated. And the goal here basically was to kind of paint Africa, but also the global, the broader globe in the Soviet bloc's shade of red. But I think what that really meant was exerting influence. So Czechoslovakia, as well as other countries in the Soviet bloc, were aware that, this is an important battlefield of ideas and of principles and a political battlefield. So they wanted to get in there through these guns, through this money, to really, create relations with the future leaders of these countries who could then be friendly to them on the international stage, or, could give them something else back more regionally. So I think that was one of the big goals there. And so throughout the late 50s and 60s, they supported these African groups. But also in the early 60s, the Cubans came in the way of Czechoslovakia. And this was a slightly different arrangement. Basically, at the time, Czechoslovakia had a very good relationship with the Cubans. I think they were actually, they got there first, even before the Soviets, and had a very good relationship with the Cubans that then they had to tone down because the Soviets got a little bit suspicious and jealous, which is a theme here in the whole book as well. And in the 60s, Fidel Castro decided that he wanted to train these revolutionaries in the Western Hemisphere, in Latin America, in places like Venezuela, Colombia, and or Brazil. And so he would fly them or they would fly to Cuba to get various training, be it ideological or be it physical kind of security, maybe military, paramilitary training. But getting to Cuba was quite complicated, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So they had to actually go through Europe and further eastward to come to Cuba from places in Latin America. And so in the 60s, for about 8 years, Prague became this crossroads for these revolutionaries from Latin America, a way to get to Cuba and get from Cuba. And so if anyone will get a chance to read the book, they'll see what some of these, how this process worked, how passports, fake, real passports were used, how difficult it was for them to get to Cuba at the time. But it also shows how difficult it is to sometimes have these allies that run these kind of operations. The Czechoslovaks were increasingly unhappy about being involved in this because it was kind of an open secret. The US knew it, the Brits knew it. It was discussed in the UN, and there was some backlash that Czechoslovakia got for this. So basically, by the late 60s, they stopped supporting this kind of revolutionary training program run by Castro. They also stopped supporting most of the groups in Africa. And until the mid-70s, there's basically a lull. Czechoslovakia is dealing with a lot of things. There was the Prague Spring. It was suppressed by the Soviets. Czechoslovakia is occupied. But then in the 1970s, mid-1970s, that's when the Palestinians and Palestinian-associated groups start coming to Prague. And that's where the story of the Palestinians in the group, in the book rather, really begins.
So before we go to the Palestinians, it might be worth highlighting the importance of the Czechoslovak arms industry in the post-war era.
Yeah, and it's not just in the post-war era. It really began when the Czech lands and Slovakia were still part of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. A lot of industry was focused in these lands, and
yeah, I think Hitler was interested in the Czechoslovak arms industry as well. Yeah,
very much so. And as as World War II was looming, the Czechoslovaks were moving quite a lot of their arms industry from the border areas bordering with Germany to further inland, because they knew that was something that Hitler was interested in. And if I remember correctly, in the interwar period, Czechoslovakia, at best a mid-sized country, was responsible for about 25% of all of world arms trade. And production, and so that's quite an achievement, if you could call it that. So this was a legacy that the Czechoslovak communist regime then inherited after World War II in '48, and they sold weapons to many groups, many people, many countries. There's great papers on this written about how much ideology mattered, and they kind of differed in the early 50s. Ideology mattered very much. They wouldn't sell weapons to countries that weren't ideologically aligned. But later on, as the 60s came and the regime became a little bit more open and maybe a bit more pragmatic, they started selling weapons to many others. They would sell weapons to Pakistan and other countries which weren't really in their sphere of allies. So, but it's the arms industry has always been a big deal, and it was a draw for many countries, but also many of these groups, and that's why they came knocking on Czechoslovakia's door, because they knew that they had a lot there in those factories and in those warehouses, and groups, be it in Africa or in the Middle East, were looking to get some of this or get a share of this.
Mm-hmm. So in establishing its dealings with Palestinian groups, the communist leadership in Prague had a number of goals related to its own global standing and prestige. It wanted a foothold in the Middle East. It wanted a role in any Israeli-Palestinian peace deal that might happen. It wanted lasting influence in any Palestinian state that might be established. What was the STB willing to offer the Palestinians in pursuit of those goals, and how did it prioritize which Palestinian factions to support?
This is kind of the heart and soul of the book, is me trying to deconstruct this idea that the Czechoslovaks, the Soviets, and many other Central European states at the time, that they just supported everyone and gave them whatever they wanted. When I started going through those tens of thousands of documents in the archive, I found that the story was a little bit more complicated, and that there was support for some groups, but for others there wasn't. And so basically, I argue that the relationship between Prague and these various groups, such as the Palestinian Liberation Organization and its various factions, such as Al-Fatah, which was run by Arafat, or the PFLP, which was run by George Habash, a big figure in the
that was
Palestinian
Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine.
Exactly.
One of the infamous groups of the 1970s, involved in many plane hijackings. Yeah.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Yes, it's an alphabet soup of acronyms here. But there were other smaller groups, which, as we'll maybe discuss later, caused quite a lot of havoc, especially in Europe, such as the Abu Nidal organization, the ANO, or Carlos the Jackals organization, which had very complicated names. So I just call it the Carlos group. But basically, I argue that Czechoslovakia used the STB as somewhat of a Swiss Army knife. And so in some cases, with respect to some groups, they used tools which would enable Prague to strike a liaison with them, a relationship cooperation, be it political or security. And with others, the STB was used to either infiltrate these groups to find out what they were up to and whether they were planning any attacks on Soviet bloc territory, or to even manipulate those groups and maybe set them against each other, discredit some of their members, or in the most extreme of cases, to oust these guys from Czechoslovakia, which I think are some of the most dramatic scenes in the book. Now, how did they decide who to really align with and who to not? I think there's two factors that really played a key role. One is the importance of the group. So how strategically important is the PLO, or Carlos the Jackal? And the answer was the PLO is very important. They're playing a crucial role, especially after the Six-Day War in 1967, when the Arab states were defeated by Israel. The Palestinians really kind of came on the international stage, as in the PLO. So it was about the group's importance. Carlos the Jackal was seen as a bit of a thug, and an unpredictable thug. So they didn't really ascribe any strategic or political importance to him, and that's why they never struck a relationship with him. The second thing was violence. Like, to what extent are they using what they euphemistically, the Czechoslovaks, called armed struggle in theater in the Middle East, and to what extent they're exporting it to Europe and maybe even to the Soviet bloc? And I think this is something that we kind of underestimated before. Me and many of my colleagues in other countries, such as in Bulgaria, East Germany, or Germany, or just the people who study the Soviet bloc and its relationship with these groups. I think one of the most interesting things was that we found that these regimes were actually quite worried and about what these groups could do on their territory or in Europe as such. So and this basically meant, are they going to blow anything up? Are they going to kidnap someone? Are they going to hijack an airplane? And will they want to land in Bratislava airport? So these are all considerations that they were going through. And so the second factor of how they chose who to align with was, are they still using violence on an international scale? Are they attacking their targets in Europe? Or is there potential of them attacking either us or maybe another group on our territory? So those were kind of the two key, I think, factors that weighed into Czechoslovakia's decision on who to align with and who to not. And when it came to support, so ultimately the big reveal, there's a spoiler alert for all those who like to be surprised by long academic books. Big spoiler alert is that throughout those 70s and 80s, Prague created a close liaison and an alliance with the PLO, with the official umbrella organization of the Palestinians. This meant that they gave them political support, that in the UN they would kind of speak in their favor and support them on various other international fora. They would give them some weapons, but very limited amount, which was quite surprising to me because of Czechoslovakia being this, arms industry empire, you could call it. But they sold them quite a lot of weapons, and above all, they gave them training. So this was security training, mostly counterintelligence, personal protection of VIPs, that kind of stuff. They didn't provide what the Czechoslovaks call terrorist training. They said that they were asked by the Palestinians if they could provide, training in partisan warfare, maybe in explosives, that kind of stuff. But the Czechoslovaks refused. And they also provided or kind of discussed various covert operations. This was kind of an icky part of that relationship because you could see that the Czechoslovaks' comfort zone when it came to carrying out things like assassinations or kidnappings in the late 70s, 80s was that appetite wasn't as big as the appetite on the Palestinian side. So this is kind of how support would have looked like and did look like when it came to the PLO. But the other groups and the other factions, such as this PFLP one that we mentioned, they were maybe not left out entirely in the cold, but there was never a strategic alliance such as the one with Arafat's PLO.
Yeah. So I recall from your introduction that your book is partly a response to Claire Sterling's book, The Terrorist Networks. This was a very influential book published by an American journalist in Italy in the early 1980s, 1981, which was very influential at the beginning of the Reagan administration. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the book at the time basically made a claim. It made many claims. It's difficult to find an argument. I've read the book a couple of times. Difficult to put a finger on an argument there, but there's lots of assertions, assumptions, stories, angles, and smaller kind of sub arguments there. But the big takeaway for anyone who reads that book basically would be that the Soviet Union was the puppeteer at the time in the 70s and 80s and even the 60s, and that they were basically running these groups against the West and directing them to attack various Western targets, and by doing so, to kind of undermine the Western way of life. So basically, she made this big strategic argument about the Soviet Union not only being an evil empire ideologically and because of the East-West competition, but also because it was using this covert warfare basically to attack the West. Now, we didn't find, or I didn't find, and my colleagues in other countries, we didn't find a plan that would substantiate this theory. History is often a lot more complicated than these, I would say, cognitive shortcuts. What we did find is that, say, when it came to these strategic alliances with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, with Arafat, there was a close level of collaboration between the various Soviet bloc member states. They wanted to know what the Soviet Union thought about this group. They wanted to know if it was okay to do business with them, to sell them weapons, to train them, what kind of training the Soviets provided, what kind of training the East Germans provided. But ultimately, each country kind of chose to interact with them in their own way. For instance, the East Germans trained them in partisan warfare. The Czechoslovaks said, this is where we draw a red line. We're not going to do this. We might have trained the Africans in the 60s in, handling TNT and carrying out ambushes, but we're not going to do this with the Palestinians, because if they're going to carry out an operation in France and the French police will arrest them and they'll find out that they were trained in this in Czechoslovakia, we're going to get into trouble. We don't want to get into trouble. We are dealing arms across the world. We're dealing crystal. We have a lot of international trade going on, and we don't want association with these kind of volatile actors, and especially association that's that can result in assassinations, kidnappings, or other things to undermine our international standing. So my first kind of pushback against Claire Sterling is that we didn't find that there was a conspiracy. We didn't find that Moscow would tell East Berlin or Budapest or Prague, hey, this is how you do it, and this is kind of the way you're going to carry out these relations or strike these relations with Arafat. Also, what we didn't find, or what I didn't find, was any strategy when it came to the other groups. The smaller groups, the Carlos, the Jackals, the Abu Nidal organizations. Actually, the Czechoslovaks often seem to be at loss, and they, you were reading their internal comms, and they would say, "We don't really know what to do with these guys, and we don't know what our friends, the Soviets, think about them. Let's try to find out." And they would often try to find out and wouldn't hear back. So it was a much messier affair, and I didn't manage to find any kind of a Soviet bloc-wide strategy when it came to dealing with these groups. So I think it was a maybe good effort in terms of collecting interesting little tidbits and stories from Claire Sterling's end in the early 80s. There's some interesting stories there, but I think the conclusions that are made there are a bit more, as you say, sensationalist than they would be if she had a bit of insight into the archives, which, of course, at the time she wouldn't be able to have, and we now do.
Right. She was going on what intel sources and police
Well,
sources were giving her.
as we're us academics, we're quite heavy on methodology. We're always curious about how people find things out. I don't think she has a little addendum where she would tell us where she got all her intelligence or all her information, but it's highly likely that she would have been talking to sources from CIA and other bits of U.S. government who would have been based either in Rome or in other parts of Western Europe. Actually, I think she admits that she is speaking to them in the book. And there was a lot of stuff in the media at around that time as well, that might have made the impression that this was an organized assault. I mean, if you kind of look at it from the outside, you have dozens of attacks across years, and these are attacks that actually seem to be quite similar. In many cases, they're using Soviet bloc weaponry. In many cases, these people had previously visited Prague. I mean, you wouldn't quite learn why, but now we know many of them would come there just to hang out or to lay low, or they had girlfriends there, or they wanted to meet some of their colleagues from the Middle East, or some of them, one of them actually came there for medical treatment and after a terrorist attack. So I think that's the issue there is that so sometimes when things are going on in real time, you do get insight into what's going on, but you don't always get the why right. And I think that that's the problem with that book.
Right. So the background to all this is that there were a number of very frightening terrorist attacks and plane hijackings starting in the late 1960s, running all through the 1970s, that people on both sides of the Iron Curtain were reacting to. So much of the book concerns the STB's responses to a series of spectacular terrorist attacks mounted by various groups in the name of the Palestinian cause, starting with high-profile plane jackings by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine in the late 60s, early 70s, the hideous massacre of Israeli athletes in Munich by the Black September Group in 1972. Similar attacks continued well into the 1980s. So how did those attacks change the STB's calculations about the costs and benefits of dealing with different actors and who should and shouldn't be allowed onto Czechoslovak territory?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because they did factor this in when they were speaking to some of the groups that would have carried out these high profile attacks. For instance, when it came to the PFLP, so the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which was led by George Habash, who we already mentioned. So ideologically, he was very close to the Soviet bloc, and he was a Marxist, and they quite liked him, and he very much liked them because he did seek medical treatment in Czechoslovakia as well, and actually they saved his life there once. But when I read through many conversations that he would have had with people from the Ministry of Interior or from the Communist Party, the fact that his group, his faction, basically was the first one to carry out these high-profile hijackings in the late 60s and in the early 70s that lingered over those conversations constantly. And he was always trying to make a case. Quite interesting to see these guys make cases for how they've changed and how that was a way of, getting attention to the Palestinian cause, which, you can kind of, we've seen this with other groups, so it's not that unusual. But then the Czechoslovaks would see that, out would kind of write a brief after the meeting, and they would say, well, this is all very well, but we know that PFLP was involved in an attack 2 months ago. So when he's saying this is a matter of the past and this is something that happened 8-10 years ago, we know it's not true. So these conversations about violence and how these groups use violence really factored in and weighed in. When it came to the Munich 1972 attack at the Olympic Games, so I think most scholars agree that this would have been carried out by people who were associated by Arafat, and that Arafat might not have known about it, but that it was carried out by this loose community of people who were their rage was triggered for a number of reasons, as a result of the Jordanian civil war, but also they saw these other factions get quite a lot of attention through these high profile attacks. And so in 72 they decided to attack and kill these Israeli athletes during the Munich Olympic Games. But there was a level of deniability. You didn't have Arafat kind of stand up and say, we carried this out because we wanted to do X, Y, Z. There was this shadow of who's responsible for this, and did Arafat know about this? Is this linked to the PLO or not? And because of this deniability, these questions about this attack didn't come up as much as questions about the PFLPs or other groups who openly claimed their responsibility for attacks would have. So I think the Czechoslovaks basically must have understood that a number of people around Arafat, such as someone called Abu Yad, who I speak about quite extensively in the book, because he was kind of the godfather of the alliance with the Czechoslovak STB. So they knew that he was somehow engaged in 1972. But at that time, they themselves didn't really have the sources to find out in what way, and it wasn't, it wasn't something that was at the time publicly known. So that deniability helped, I think, the Czechoslovaks kind of close their eyes and go ahead with that alliance with the PLO. But then maybe when it comes to violence, the smaller groups, they were very violent. For instance, the Abu Nidal organization or Carlos the Jackal. Basically, that disqualified them from the get-go. They had no strategic value to the Czechoslovaks, to the Soviet bloc. Plus, they were violent, and with that violence, when it came to these smaller groups, was often mentioned in the same sentence as volatility or unpredictability. And there's nothing that a totalitarian regime likes less than unpredictability. And so they were really in a different category than the PLO and the PLO factions from the get-go.
I mean, I remember reading about that idea in accounts of the early Bolsheviks. There was this hatred of spontaneity, like this desire not to have anything spontaneous happen within Soviet society once the Bolsheviks were in power. And you mention risks that the STB was aware of. So internal conflict between different Palestinian groups on Czechoslovak territory. So there could be violent incidents between the Palestinians. I think you mention the possible danger to foreign diplomats on Czechoslovak territory. And also the regime's idea of itself as, a police state likes to present an image of serene security. And if you have Palestinian factions getting into violent conflict on Czechoslovak territory, it tarnishes the brand.
Exactly. And, the book also, it on one hand, it talks about the STB and about intelligence and how intelligence is used to monitor or foster collaboration with these groups. But it does also discuss the kind of international politics of the Palestinian cause, if I may call it that, where it's clear that there's inside the Palestinian milieu or the movement, there's constant conflict, and they're falling out and coming back together, falling out, coming back together. And the Czechoslovaks and the Soviets and these Germans are kind of looking at this from afar. And that's when they start really becoming anxious. And I call them at some point anxious hosts about this lack of unity, and how this lack of unity can result into, can kind of spill onto their territory, and can result in assassinations, kidnappings, other things happening on their territory. And for instance, in the 80s or late 70s, 80s, Abu Nidal, who isn't as well known as the other jackals. I call these guys, all of them, jackals for various reasons. And
explain the term. So it comes from
really...
Carlos the Jackal, but you use it as a kind of catch-all for, let's say, violent non-state actors under the STB's surveillance.
Yeah, so I make a broader argument. I'll let people kind of read this. I think it's on page 1, so you don't have to get far in the book to read all the reasons why I decided on this. There's many books that discuss who's a terrorist and who's a revolutionary. I discussed that very briefly, and I didn't want to get into that discussion. I think there's people in these stories which I depict in the book who would probably fall into category A, and there's also people who would fall into category B, and then there's people who would fall into both. And so my way out of this was calling them jackals, and calling them jackals kind of metaphorically, because at the time in the early 70s, I mean, I was kind of inspired by Frederick Forsyth's book, The Jackal, or The Day of the Jackal, which talks about an assassin who's meant to assassinate the French president. So I make some metaphors based on that story, and use that term to call these various violent non-state actors who were associated with the Palestinian cause the jackals. And there's other attributes that jackals have, which I describe, and how I explain why I use that term. But I just found it an easier way to bring people into the story than if I started with a heavy 50-page discussion on who's a terrorist and who is not. And when I use the term terrorism in the book, I use it to denote tactics that these guys used. I don't quite put labels on who's who. There's a lot of fantastic books that would discuss these groups, and would discuss which category they would fall into.
So one of the really interesting things that's going on in the book, which Claire Sterling would not have been aware of in the 1980s, is that, well, there's kind of a contradiction. So the STB is inclined to support the PLO because the PLO is the largest Palestinian group. It's the one that's likeliest to be involved in peace negotiations or the founding of a state. But the PLO, or parts of the PLO, certainly Arafat, is courting the West and wants a degree of approval and good reception in the West. The people who are ideologically closer to the Eastern Bloc are also the ones who are most extreme, most likely to be involved in terrorist attacks. So, so you've got the violent radicals like Carlos the Jackal, who most worried the STB, were often Marxist-Leninists. So they were violent, they were opportunistic, they had tradecraft that recalled the Russian revolutionaries of the late 19th and early centuries, and late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so what kind of emerges is a sense that the STB was clashing indirectly with the founding myths of the Soviet state. Right.
I mean, I think I think that's a great observation. Sorry, Roland. But I would leave it to the Marxists to probably write a good account of to what extent they had to compromise their Marxist credentials. But I think you're absolutely right that these states or these communist regimes that came to power in the late 40s, early 50s, they really wanted to just be friends with people who were like them and who were Marxist like them. But the world and life is more complicated, and so the people who started coming to them for support, and sometimes these were leaders from African or other states, but also these jackals from within the Palestinian movement. They weren't the kind of people that they would have hoped would have come their way. And with Arafat, you're absolutely right. I discussed this in various bits of the book about how untrustworthy the Soviet bloc found him, and in some cases this was because he decided to make big, kind of quite rash decisions, such as aligning himself with the Jordanian king at some point, which really kind of shocked the Soviet bloc, and suggested to them that he was really defecting to the other side of the Iron Curtain. There were also people from other factions who often came to Prague and were complaining and were kind of giving the Czechoslovaks insight on how pro-Western Arafat was. So if they could choose their ideal Palestinian leader to deal with, it wouldn't have been Arafat. It would probably have been George Habash, who was a Marxist, but George Habash would have had to have not conducted and kind of blessed all these large-scale terrorist attacks, hijackings of the late 1960s and 70s. So there is a paradox about who you align with and what principles they ascribe to, and sometimes you kind of have to close your eyes to let realpolitik, I guess, stomp over your ideology if you want to achieve some of your strategic goals. But when it came to the smaller groups, say Carlos the Jackal, who went around Prague, he was a very flamboyant figure, and he was first associated with the Palestinians in the early 70s, and then had a big row after a big operation in Vienna, the OPEC raid, with a key figure from the Palestinian movement, who was kind of the godfather of many of these PFLP attacks. They fell out, and Carlos went solo in the second half of the 70s, and that's when he started coming to Czechoslovakia, East Germany, these kind of places. And he would walk around Prague, and he wouldn't start a conversation without telling you that he was a Marxist. And he came from a family of a wealthy Venezuelan, what I call champagne Marxist, which is the best kind of Marxist. You have enough money to tell people that they don't need money. But the regime didn't believe him. They, tapped sometimes tapped his rooms. They had quite a lot of agents who were reporting back to them about what Carlos was up to in Prague, and they just said, you know what, this guy, he's a loose cannon. He's not a real Marxist. This is just a label he's using. So, to kind of get this Che Guevara vibe going around him. So I think that actually kind of plays in their advantage of trying to of kind of showing that the regime didn't just accept it when someone called themselves a Marxist, but that they really drilled into the politics of these groups and said, you know what, this is just on the surface. This isn't really the same kind of Marxism we're ascribing to.
So with figures like Carlos and Habash, you could get the very strong sense that they would have been influenced by Lenin and Lenin's tradecraft, Lenin's intrigue, and maybe the earlier Russian nihilists, for example. But those kinds of people weren't wanted in the Eastern Bloc by the 1960s, 1970s, particularly after the Prague Spring. I'm sure everything was about normalization, creating stability. They didn't need any more Lenins.
Yeah, you know what? This is maybe goes beyond the book a bit more, but in my other projects, I look at how Czechoslovakia during those 40 years of communism, how and when they used these quite violent covert operations, your assassinations, kidnappings, these kind of things. And based on what I found in the archives, but also other fantastic Czech and Slovak historians who work on this topic, we basically found that in the early years of the regime, in the late 1940s, early 50s, that's when the regime was at its most violent. That's when it was using a lot of these covert techniques that the Palestinians would be using later, such as kidnappings. There were more than 24 kidnappings of Czechoslovak dissidents in the late 40s and early 50s. This was an attempt to bring people who were critical of the regime living abroad and kind of fighting against the regime, bring them back and basically sentence them and silence them. There were about 4 or 5 assassinations in the 50s and in the early 60s. But after the mid and in the early 60s, actually, they also set up a dedicated sabotage unit. So kind of sabotage operations we're seeing today, they also have a long history, and that history in Czechoslovakia goes back to the early 60s when they thought that there would be World War III, and so they would need to blow up bridges, they would need to set various warehouses on fire or contaminate drinking water reservoirs, let's say. But after the mid 60s, and especially after the suppression of the Prague Spring, things quite quietened down. I think the regime is choosing stability over showing its strength, over poking its opponents abroad. And so actually these ventures, such as the kidnapping, such as the sabotage stuff, they never go ahead in the last 20 years of the regime. So perhaps if the Palestinians had come in the 50s, there might have been more understanding for some of the methods that they use, and the regime might have been more open to, say, using them as their proxies, which we don't see in the case of Czechoslovakia, or helping them with carrying out some of these operations. But we don't really see this in the 70s and 80s. That in the 70s and 80s, they encounter Czechoslovakia that's quite conflict avoidant, that's quite anxious about its own role, about its own business interests, and that doesn't really sit well with the way the Palestinians want to operate.
I mean, the Prague Spring seems like a major factor there, because the Prague Spring was 68, which I think was the year of the first PFLP hijacking. So that hijacking coincides with the weakening of the regime and the weakening of the regime's legitimacy.
It does in hindsight. I mean, it doesn't really, it's not connected in any way. But yeah, it is actually it's actually at around that time when the Palestinians decide to opt for this international campaign of political violence to bring attention to their cause. When the Czechoslovaks are occupied by the Soviets and they're dealing with their own internal struggles, lots of people from the STB, say, are purged, are ousted. They have to rebuild parts of the STB, bring in new people, more ideological people. So they're kind of going through their own regime rebuilding exercise. And by the time that's kind of stabilized by the mid 70s, that's when the Palestinians come, and the Czechoslovaks aren't kind of meeting them at the same level of, maybe at the same type of strategy or tactics that the Palestinians are wanting to use.
Yeah. The two darkest things I remember from the book are, at one point, the STB wanting to get the PLO involved in an active measure to promote an anti-Semitic text throughout the Middle East, and from the Palestinian end, a willingness to target Czechoslovak dissidents in the West.
Yes. Yeah. These are fascinating documents, which we obviously, when you go to the National Archive here in London, or if you go to NARA, the National Archive just outside of DC, you don't really see this much detail. And in the Czech archives, we see in minuscule detail the conversations between the Palestinians, between the STB, the Minister of Interior, who's in charge of the STB, so his conversations with these Palestinians. And then we also see conversations of the departments that are dedicated to these kind of covert operations and what they think about this. And you're absolutely right. So at some point I think in 1981, the Palestinians, namely Abu Iyad, this gentleman I mentioned before, who we believe was connected and was kind of one of the masterminds of the Munich 1972 Olympic massacre. So he came to Prague, and a number of operations or suggestions for operations came out of that. One was the Czechoslovaks. They were always very good at disinformation, at propaganda, at using their services to spread various messaging that would weaken the West or undermine some of its interests and all that. It kind of echoes, or it was the prequel to what we're seeing from Russia today. Czechoslovaks were doing this on the behalf of the Soviet bloc. They were deception masters. So they basically wanted to use the Palestinians as a tool to help them with some of this deception and to spread it in the Middle East. Palestinians had publications that were far-reaching across the Middle East. and could have basically helped the Czechoslovaks spread some of this, in this case, anti-Semitic propaganda. The communist regime was anti-Semitic. It was very anti-Israel. They cut relations in 67. The Palestinians, I mean, we don't have the Palestinian documents to show us what the Palestinians thought about this, but it's clear that they were dragging their feet. This wasn't the kind of, gray zone or warfare that they wanted to do. So ultimately, they did help with placing some disinformation or propaganda into their various journals and media outlets, but it didn't seem like they were enthusiastic about this. What they were maybe not enthusiastic about it, but what they pitched to the Czechoslovaks, and they pitched this to other services in the Soviet bloc, was either kidnapping or killing some of Czechoslovak dissidents. And there's a fascinating point that maybe this is why you remember it, because there's a dissonance between what the political leaders want and between what the STB is happy to carry out. And so when Abu Yad says, we could help you kidnap these two dissidents, one living in Paris, one living in Rome, who both of them have been very critical of the regime for a long time. What do you say? The Minister of Interior, someone by the name of Obzina, he says, yeah, why not? Let's explore this. And then when you look at the documents, it trickles down to the Active Measures Department, to the Covert Operations Department, and they're horrified. And they say, we can't do this. We don't know these comrades from Adam. We don't know how they operate. We don't really know who they are. We don't know how serious they are. We don't know how they would carry this out. This is a very vague plan. But at the same time, they don't want to insult them. So they don't want to go back and say, no, thank you, this is a horrible idea. So they say, well, let's just try to kind of let this fade out. Let's not mention it. And if they mention it again, then let's definitely say no to assassinations. Maybe one of these kidnappings, but we would kind of have to then discuss how this all goes. So it shows the regime.
Maybe just a little kidnapping. Yeah.
Exactly. So it kind of shows that there's a lot of things that this shows. It shows that ultimately these are totalitarian intelligence and security services. So if there has to be a kidnapping, there will be a kidnapping. But it also shows that they're not operating in a vacuum. They're operating in a political and politically sensitive and geopolitically sensitive environment, and that even the officers on the ground, so to say, realize and know what type of operations are toxic in the 70s and 80s, and especially in the 80s, and which aren't. Because this is, and the book discusses this in the latter part. You have the Helsinki process in the mid 70s. You have detente in the 70s, and so that also impacts how these states,
right?
How
so
far
the
they
heightened diplomacy in the case of the Helsinki process to, the Soviet Union wants to normalize the borders of the Warsaw Pact, the post-war zone of influence of Moscow.
Exactly. So the last thing you want to do is kill someone on the street of Rome. And, they knew from the 50s and early 60s when they carried out those 4 or 5 assassinations. In all of those cases, it became quite clear quite quickly that the Czechoslovaks were behind this. So even in a world without a sophisticated open source intelligence and cameras everywhere, it wasn't that difficult to figure out who was behind, or who would have been behind an attack against a Czechoslovak dissident in Rome. So they wanted to stay away, and this is where I think there was almost like a cultural clash, or what I call a mismatch of expectations and a mismatch of what tactics both sides, the Palestinians and the Czechoslovaks, were willing to use in the late 70s and the 80s. So ultimately, yes, there was an alliance, but I don't think it was a happy alliance. It was quite an anxious alliance between partners who had different objectives and preferred different means.
Yeah. So when you were working on the book, as part of your research, you interviewed a number of people who worked for the STB under the Czechoslovak regime. I'd be curious to hear about how you went about initiating contact with them, how they responded, how the interviews went.
Well, when I started, this was actually just before I started my PhD, which was on this topic and which the book is based on. And I started it very naively. I had, because of these documents, I had quite a lot of names of officers who served in the Middle East or worked on, say, the counterterrorism, quote unquote, desk in Prague. And so I at first tried cold calling them. So I spent the best part of summer 2015 just basically going through the telephone list and calling people up and asking them if they had worked for the government in the 70s and 80s. Now your listeners and your watchers will be shocked to find out that this didn't get me very far. I think I found two, but they weren't that happy to talk to a random lady who called them on the phone. But in parallel, I was talking to various people who I knew had, various diplomats and various other folks I knew maybe from my previous, previous work in Slovakia. And Slovakia and the Czech Republic are quite small places. So you know how this goes. Like you talk to a guy who knows a guy and he knows a guy. And the next thing I know, I'm sitting across from someone in a slightly dodgy bar who used to work for the Communist Party's international department. So their kind of own internal Communist Party's kind of Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So I ended up then getting access to quite interesting people. I talked to a number of STB officers who either were tasked with watching and ousting Carlos the Jackal, or with recruiting various Palestinian sources, Syrian sources on Czechoslovak territory. So they would give me a bit of insight into how this worked and what some of the challenges linked to this were. I also talked to a couple of Communist Party representatives who helped supply weapons to some Middle Eastern groups and discussed in quite minuscule detail about how they went to, when they got the go-ahead from the head of the Communist Party and from the Soviets, they went into a shop, bought some guns, went to the airport, put these on a plane, and flew them to Damascus. And then I also talked to people outside Czechoslovakia, and I for instance, interviewed a couple of times the French judge who basically got Carlos the Jackal behind bars, who told me about how he was sitting in the cell with him and smoking cigars, and they were trying to one-up each other. And I also talked to a couple of folks from former CIA analysts um, or ops people, officers who would have dealt with counterterrorism at around the time. And one of them was someone who was one of the analysts who were asked by Bill Casey, head of CIA at the time in the early 80s, to prove that Claire Sterling's book was right about this conspiracy, Moscow's conspiracy to run these groups against the West. So that was really
the phrasing is compelling. So they were asked to they were given a teleological project to prove the book was right, rather than to simply investigate whether its claims were right.
So they were basically asked to find through their own means or prove that what she was saying was right. And I think there were two exercises, analytical exercises, the so-called NIE's, National Intelligence Estimates, in the early mid 80s that were basically produced to answer this question. And I think there were two, because after the first one didn't support her theory. It said, there's a lot of evidence out there to show that the Soviets and their allies are supporting what they view as national liberation movements. So this is Arafat, his official PLO umbrella organization, which, by the way, at the time also had an office in DC and in many Western European states, right? But they're saying there's very little evidence of these guys actually supporting or using Carlos the Jackal and others to attack the West. So I think after the first exercise, Casey told him that, why the hell am I paying you $50,000 a year, whereas I bought this book for, I don't know, $12, and it told me more than you guys did. And I think I said this kindly. I think he uses slightly ruder language. So in some of these analysts' minds, this was a an era of politicization of intelligence. There's other analysts who were around at the time who would say they disagree, but there were many analysts who felt that they were being pushed into adopting a view of how the Soviet bloc was interacting with these groups, which just there wasn't enough evidence for.
Yeah. Yeah.
I also want to say I did talk to I mean, ultimately, as I said in the beginning, this is not a history of the PLO of its international campaign. There's fantastic books that have done that already. So most of my sources are from Central Eastern Europe. I did talk to some Palestinians and Syrians for background, but as you can imagine, it's quite difficult to get people to talk about this kind of stuff on the record, especially because the story is from the 70s and 80s, and I think that's possible because these archives are open. And these people at around the time were quite young and are still, many of them are still living in Central Eastern Europe.
Mm-hmm. So, in contrast to the extreme openness of the Czech state towards its own intelligence history, Russia never opened up to the same extent at the end of the Cold War. And of course, the war in Ukraine and the entrenched dictatorship that exists now have only made it more secretive. But Moscow is really the missing piece here. So what if, under some more democratic regime in the future, Russia was to one day open up its intelligence archives? What would you like to know about its relationship with Prague and to international terrorism during the period covered by the book?
I'd like to know everything. But I think it's a great question, although quite a hypothetical because it probably won't happen anytime soon.
Yeah, of course.
But I'd love to know, in general, but also when it comes to this point, how Moscow viewed its allies, how it viewed Czechoslovakia, and how this view changed across time. And specifically when it comes to the Palestinians, I'd be interested in how Moscow viewed Czechoslovakia's more subtle or conservative approach to to these guys, aka that they refused to train them in partisan warfare, refused to give them certain types of weapons. There's a story there in the book where the Czechoslovaks refused to sell silencers to the Palestinians. So I'd love to know about that dynamic and about what the Soviets thought about that.
Right, the request for 100 silencers by someone from the JSS, which was the
Joint Security Service of the PLO, yeah.
Yes, could I have 100 silencers, please?
Which was another, I mean, oftentimes it's another big argument I make in the book is that oftentimes we think of these totalitarian regimes as these monoliths, as these regimes where everyone at every ministry basically thinks in a similar way. But this particular episode from the book shows us that this Palestinian representative from the embassy was kind of sanctioned by someone high up in the Ministry of Interior, and this Ministry of Interior person said, yeah, go to these arms dealers, these state-based arms companies we have, and you're okay for asking for these things. So they kind of had a political blessing there, and then they turn up to this arms company and they say, we'd like these 100 pistols matched with 100 silencers, and the arms dealers, they go a bit bezunked, and it's one of the most interesting documents I saw because they send a letter to the Ministry of Interior and they say, who are you sending here? What kind of people are you sending over? We are experienced arms dealers. We know very well what silencers are used for. We know they're not used for open warfare or open conflict. They're typically used for terrorist attacks, and we don't have anything to do with this. So, that's not to say that the Czechoslovaks have never sold weapons to people who then did dodgy things with them and have killed others. There were lots of Lebanese and Cypriot and many other arms dealers who came there on a weekly basis and were sold things. And sold various weapons. But
the Scorpion machine pistol seems to have been in high demand.
Yeah, exactly. But in this case, we kind of see that the Palestinian, that the Czechoslovaks draw a red line and they just say, listen, guys, we don't want to get involved in this.
Mm-hmm. So when you're researching this topic, well, I think when you research a book, you tend to juxtapose your topic with what you're seeing in the world around you. So when we think about Czechoslovakia's relations with, let's say, countries in what Russia would now call the global south, or with the Palestinians, what's the legacy?
Legacy for the Palestinians, for the Czechoslovaks, for the Soviets.
What has the old Czechoslovak regime left in the world? In other words, what have been the knock-on effects of their support for those groups?
See, that's a really interesting question. And I would actually say, after having written a really long book and spent about 10 years studying this, is that the impact was much more subtle than what Claire Sterling thought and what Bill Casey thought in the early 80s, and that it was less about enabling these Palestinians to carry out terrorist attacks or to fight their own um, national liberation struggle in the Middle East, and that it was more about risk management, and that this is more a story of how do states, which kind of attract people who are carrying out violent international campaigns. How did they deal with these kind of approaches? Do they let them slide? Do they push them out? Do they create an alliance with them? So I think the legacy here is more about how totalitarian regimes work, how they change over time, and how they, I think, much like many other states, have to engage in risk management when it comes to violent, unpredictable non-state actors. And so I think that's the kind of the big takeaway. I'm not entirely sure that if Abu Yad never came to Prague, that would have made any substantial impact on the Palestinian struggle. But that this whole story, I think, tells us a lot about how totalitarian states work, how these jackals go about doing their international diplomacy, and how they all used their spies to either collaborate or to push each other away.
Mhm. All right, thanks, Daniela. Let's leave it there. So the book is "Watching the Jackals: Prague's Covert Liaisons with Cold War Terrorists and Revolutionaries." Daniela is on Bluesky at D Richterova and Instagram at D Richterova_KCL. To support the Orwellians, you can subscribe to the Orwellians Substack at theorwellians.substack.com or donate via the Stripe link in the show notes. I'm on X at Roland E. Brown, Instagram at Roland Elliott Brown. You can read my long-form articles in New Lines magazine. My book with Fuel Publishing, Godless Utopia, Soviet Anti-Religious Propaganda, is getting a bit harder to find, but it looks like Amazon still has some copies. Daniela, thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, Roland.